in 35 millimeter, it really showed the texture of the photography, the light and shadow. That
He loves shadows.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Hi,
Now,
everybody. Hi.
I wanted to ask, how many of you saw this movie for the first time today? Oh wow,
Oh,
really?
wow.
Wow.
Almost everybody.
Wow, that's great. That's
Okay.
great. We really want to engage with you and hear your feedback on it. I want to start by asking you, Nicole, after Cabaret and that huge success, and Fosse won the Academy Award as Best Director, he could have done anything he wanted. What do you think attracted him to this story about Lenny Bruce?
I mean, I think Lenny Bruce's message is incredibly important and still pertinent today. And I believe that Fosse, do I call my father Dad? I believe that Fosse felt a kinship with him in some way. You know, Fosse was always pushing the envelope. He was always showing what we didn't know was there, we didn't want to see, and the full spectrum of what's actually happening in a situation. He was never just showing that, you know, if something's sexy, it's all sexy and sexy, sexy, sexy. It can also be sad, it can also be angry, it can also be ugly, it's not always beautiful. That there's a lot of, you know, taboos, and he was always showing the taboos. And I think, you know, that's the same thing that Lenny Bruce was doing. So I believe that my father was probably inspired by him, and in some ways, you know, the same way he emulated Fred Astaire in certain situations, he also, or situations like an overall feeling of emulating Fred Astaire at times, he also emulated Lenny Bruce's approach to exposing parts of life and making us think differently. The audience, when I say us, I mean the audience, making us think differently about what we're seeing.
I thought it was interesting in that last courtroom scene where he says to the judge, don't take away my words, and we need a deviant. We need a deviant.
Right, to show you when you're blowing it.
Yeah.
And the harder you come down on me, the more you need the deviant, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, why do you think he wanted to, chose to photograph the movie in black and white?
I think I believe it has a documentary feel. It has a newspaper feeling. It sort of sets it in a time period, right? And he loves shadows. I think he found as much storytelling in shadows as he did in the actual images themselves. And I believe showing the gradations of gray, the 50 Shades of Gray in between, right? Like, was, it's easier to do, or more apparent to do, more interesting in black and white than in color.
Yeah, it's such a visually fascinating movie. The color, the light and shadow.
Right.
The
Well,
textures.
there's no like mountain scenes in there, anything with, you know, like goats and skipping and
Yeah.
skirts and things, right?
Right.
It's a lot of close-ups on faces.
Right.
And, yeah.
Right. What are some of the impressions that you had? Are there questions that you'd like to ask Nicole? Comments or observations? Yeah, Kate.
This is cheating, but I do. I just would love to know, Nicole, when we invited you to come do this, you know, we said you could do any Fosse film you like, whatever you choose, and I would just love to know what made you choose this. I thought it was such an interesting choice.
Well, I think because of my father's feeling of connection to Lenny Bruce, doing very similarly to what Lenny Bruce did. I mean, has anybody seen Sweet Charity yet? Did that open yet? Has anyone seen Sweet Charity yet? Okay, so when you watch Big Spender, right, those women, right, they are hot and sexy and alluring and fabulous looking and all of that, but come back, watch it again. They are not going towards the audience saying, like, you know, love me. They're all different levels of devoid of sexuality. Their bodies are beautiful, their movements are beautiful, what they're saying is alluring, but as an actor, as actresses, what they're playing is tired, angry, detached, right? And so I think, you know, that's, and you find yourself very attracted to them, and then if you think about what you're being attracted to, it can be a little bit uncomfortable, right? It's like, do I really want, you know, you watch and you go, yeah, I wanna be like that, and it's like, no, I don't, right? Right? And it can be confusing because life is confusing and the human condition is confusing. And so I think that was my father's attraction to it, and that's why I wanted to, you know, be here for this movie. It's a bold movie, and it's still
Indeed.
really pertinent today too.
I was just thinking as I was watching it, Bruce's riffs on anti-Semitism, gay issues, they're still very relevant, sadly.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to be very delicate how I talk about this, but it seems like the issue of language is still ever present.
Right.
But the parties that are expressing themselves, that has flipped
That's flipped.
around.
Yeah.
That's flipped
Yeah.
around, you know? It seemed like it was, yeah. I don't know, does anybody want to comment on that? Like, how it seems like it applies today, or doesn't, or, yeah.
Yes, yes.
I'm so moved by this film. It's so hard to know what to say. Like it's you know, visually so incredibly beautiful. It's so hilarious, and I've seen it before. I'm obsessed, but this is the first time I've seen it since being divorced. And when you talk about how it's relevant today, I think some of it seems really outdated. And some of it still feels so present. Like the part, I didn't remember this, with the Time magazine with Jackie Kennedy. And he talks about women, you know, how we talk about them and that they're allowed to run. It made me cry. It was so ever present. And my question for you, I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but the person in this movie who does not get her own storyline is Kitty, and I can't help but think of the similarities between the two of you.
Kitty and me?
Yeah, of just having a father with such, you know, courage and just being so rebellious, and what effect that had on you as his child. I don't know if the phrasing was right there. Take it wherever you want to go.
Yeah, well, it had a massive, major effect on me, and Kitty, I don't think had access to really good behavioral health centers, which I have had. So we diverge, I'm sure. Did you have something? No. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. In the
Yes,
back.
Yeah.
What was he really editing this while rehearsing a show, as in all that jazz? Was he editing this at night while rehearsing a show during the day, or is that a?
You know, I don't know. I was 11. Probably, you know, I don't know what book you got that from, but all the authors have done a lot of research, and it's very likely. I mean, he was pretty obsessed at that point. That was after Cabaret and Pippin and Liza with a Z, right? And the Triple Crown that he won, and then there was also the psychiatric ward.
That was before he started filming this.
Right, I mean, you know, it's a lot of pressure, right? Doesn't
Yeah.
even Lenny Bruce say that there, I'm under a lot of pressure?
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
yeah. To outdo himself, or, you know, I mean, the first thing in the film is like, you know, a film by Bob Fosse, right? Like, bam, black screen, white letters, film by Bob Fosse. It's like, okay, here we go
Right,
now.
right. I believe this film opened when Fosse was in the hospital. I believe it opened
Oh,
while
okay.
he was
Okay.
in the hospital.
Yeah. I mean, Sweet Charity was kind of a flop. It was a disaster, right?
Right.
And then he got Cabaret, which was a huge success,
Right.
and now what, right?
Right, and what do you do after you win an Oscar, an Emmy, and a Tony, and have this huge, I mean, he was really, I always say he was sort of the Lin-Manuel Miranda of 1973. You know, he was all over media, he could do no wrong.
Mhm.
So how do you follow that up? So there had to have been a tremendous amount of pressure
I'm sure.
on him, yeah,
That's why you go to the psych ward, right?
Right,
I
right.
mean, like, yeah.
right, right.
Uh,
One of the interesting things that I wanted to bring up with you was, Fosse had always said, in terms of stage movement, he said sometimes small movement or no movement at all makes more of an impact than a lot of activity. And there are a lot of examples of that in his choreography. And he also does that cinematically in this movie. We were talking about this yesterday, how that last performance of Lenny's in the club just before he's arrested, Fosse just plants that camera stationary and just lets the whole
Lets him bomb
excruciating-
out,
Yeah.
lets him bomb out, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and he does that with the opening as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, Honey stands still. The first thing she does in her strip is stand there like a statue and lets you just take her in.
Yeah.
And I find it really interesting, the difference of those two scenes, right? That strip, I think, is probably one of the best strip dances I've ever seen. I mean, and it's edited, and it's close-ups, and it's the audience, and it's subtle, and it's very complicated. If you go back and watch it again, the editing and the
Yeah.
cinematography and all the messages that you're getting from all the faces, all the eyes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's very, very complicated, and then you go to Lenny on drugs, and he may be complicated, but it's not coming out, it's all very simple.
Mhm.
So I find that really interesting, the difference between those two.
Juxtaposition, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's just something, it's an observation I've had I just watched All That Jazz again recently in a big screen. It was played up in Westchester, and this one, and thinking of some of the other films I've seen, there seems to be kind of a theme he has between, kind of a conflict between the creative type and putting their message out in society. Is that something I'm just reading into it? I mean, because here's Lenny, and he's kind of at odds with the people he's trying to give his message to. In All That Jazz, which was completely autobiographical, it's him trying to say certain things, and all the people around him, sort of how that process could get interfered with, or that. And with Cabaret, it's the singers trying to do the cabaret, and then it gets shut down in the end. Even with Star 80, I mean, even though he was one of the most evil characters ever. I forget the name of the guy who was what
It
Dorothy's
was
friend.
Eric Roberts,
Paul Snyder.
Paul Snyder.
Snyder.
He was trying to get into show business in his own twisted way.
Right.
Right.
So I just wanted to, it's just something I'm putting out there, if I'm reading that correctly, or if that's in his things at all.
I mean, even Sweet Charity, charity's in show business too, right?
Yeah,
in a role like, yeah.
Right, so what is your question?
It's not really, is that true that he really did wanna show, like, the conflict between the creative and the rest of the world and what that's about? Is that a theme in his thing, or am I just reading that?
I mean, yeah,
wrong?
it does keep showing up. I don't know if it was so much that he wanted to show this conflict between the creative and society, but I think the creative represents truth tellers, storytellers that are telling the truth, that are uncovering truths, right? And then yes, that the truth is usually in conflict with society because we're so hypocritical, right? Which is what Lenny says there, right?
Yeah,
right. Yeah, what, that I saw a hand. Yes.
I should say because we can be so hypocritical. Not everybody is always hypocritical. Yeah. Sorry.
It's okay. So I guess I was curious because I only saw All That Jazz for the first time a couple of years ago. I absolutely love it now. Now I've seen all your dad's movies, but it feels like, at least for the younger generations, and I know I'm not young anymore necessarily, but but we know your dad, or like society feel it's still like choreographer, stage choreographer, dancer and such, but not the movie director, despite him having a storied career that unfortunately was cut short, like that part of things is still film nerd knowledge of, you know, the film director. He's an amazing director. So I was like blown away when I saw all that jazz and the editing and everything. And so I guess, was that something he always wanted to do? Again, I know you were young when he started doing this, but was he a big film nerd himself? And he's like, I really want to make that jump. Because it seemed like it was so seamless and effortless almost.
Well, he's a huge film nerd. He has a notebook that he kept every great shot that he ever saw in a movie. He wrote it down. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, I mean, he used to joke around about he didn't really like working with composers and lyricists, and then he didn't like working with book writers, because he would have an idea and then he'd have to collaborate with them. And I think in his very early years, that creates a foundation and helped, you know, hold him up and build him up. And then, you know, sometimes he had his way, he wanted to do something, and it was hard to collaborate, and so he continually was cutting those other people out of the picture so that he could, it was a film by Bob Fosse, not just, right? So that he could create the whole thing in his vision, you know? I mean, if you imagine, you know, Michelangelo, and, you know, somebody comes over and goes, no, we're gonna put a little thing over here. It's like, leave me alone, right? Right? So, yeah, I think that was a very natural progression for him. And so the Tony, the Emmy, the Oscar in '73, all in 1 year, those were all as director also. And I don't know why that gets marginalized. I think, I don't know, I think we're sloppy with our memories. I think people like to marginalize, oh, he was just a choreographer, right? But if you look at his choreography, what's so brilliant about it, and of course he only had 7 steps or whatever, right? But it's how he directed the performers, that they were all characters, that they all had this life in a dance, that you could have 12 people doing the same thing in unison, and they were all unique, right? And that was one of his great strengths, was to be able to do that, I think.
It always strikes me, I was reminded of this as I was watching this just now, whenever people talk about the great directors of the 1970s, they always mention Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese.
Oh, he was pissed.
Well,
Sorry.
but they never mentioned Bob Fosse, and he did Cabaret, Lenny, all that jazz, Liza with a Z, which I
Star
include,
80.
Star 80. They never mentioned him. I think part of that has to do with the fact that he was very often identified with musicals, and musicals don't get the kind of respect that Apocalypse Now gets,
Right.
and The
Right.
Godfather gets, you know. And it's really, I think he's continually being rediscovered because he's so good, and he didn't always get his critical due at the time. Yeah.
And I just started to follow up, like a couple years ago in Seattle, I rented out a theater. There's a small theater you can rent out for your friends, basically, and so it showed like 35 of my friends all that jazz for the first time on the big screen, and like everyone, like I think like one other person had seen it ever before, and everyone loved it.
And all these films, all of his films. Now Lenny's 50 years old, a half a century old, and yet these films don't look dated.
Yeah.
They have a vision. They have a cinematic language that is evergreen. It's always current, and I'm always reminded of that when I see one of his films.
The cinematographer on this, Bruce Surtees, is the son of Robert Surtees, who is the cinematographer on Sweet Charity. Yeah.
And he worked with
Nepotism.
And he worked with lots of different cinematographers. He worked with Jeffrey Unsworth on Cabaret, and Sven Nykvist on Star 80, and Giuseppe Rotuno, who's one of Fellini's cinematographers, and all that
Fellini
jazz.
used two, I think, and Giuseppe was one
Was
of
one
the
of them.
two, yeah.
So he worked with a wide range of different cinematographers who, different backgrounds, and so each of the films has a different look,
Mhm.
but very much pulled together by Fosse's aesthetic.
Well, there's a lot of similarities in the scene, the club scene to Cabaret for me when I see
Yeah.
it. You know, some of the makeup on the women and the, you know, beautiful ugliness, ugly beauty, or whatever you wanna call it, yeah.
Yeah. I was gonna mention something about, his editing. He worked with, on this film, he worked with Alan Hine for the first time. Well, Hine also edited Lies with a Z. And he worked with Hine on the other films that he did. And they created a kind of editing language that was sometimes referred to as Fosse time. With the quick cuts, the juxtaposition of scenes from across time periods. It's a unique kind of film language. And I think that's partly why the films continue to look so contemporary.
Well, they definitely have a look to them and a way of telling a story that jumps in time, and you can still follow it.
It's coherent.
Right.
It's not clumsy. It's very coherent.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not linear, right?
Right.
Like yeah.
But there's an internal logic
Yeah,
to it.
yeah. I
Yeah.
wanna hear from you all, if
Yeah.
anybody has anything to say, yeah.
So, this is my first time watching Lenny. I'm a huge fan of all that jazz, and it was really interesting watching this. It's so hard not to think of Fosse, knowing, at least, the way that similar version of, this movie's presenting all that jazz, and, the project he's editing in that, and having you here, so interested. Could you give some thoughts as, Fosse's daughter on what it's like, the autobiographical nature of all that jazz, and what it's like watching it for you?
See, I didn't really find it all that autobiographical. I mean, if we wanna get autobiographical weird, that was the FX series, okay? That was like, they walked me into the living room and I was like, oh my God, I grew up here, right? So I think there's elements of it that, yeah, absolutely, elements are autobiographical, but so is Lenny, and so is Charity, and so is Cabaret, and so is Star 80, So, I mean, just a little side story, I wanted to play Michelle, in the film, All That Jazz, and he told me I was too old. And there it began. At the age of 12, I was too old or whatever. I think it's so Fellini-esque that it's hard for me. I mean, some of the scenarios, like dancing in the living room, and yes, dancing in the living room with Anne Rankin, yes. But to me, it never felt, for me, like biographical, just maybe very loosely. Okay, so I will tell this story. So, there was a showing of Lenny at Tony Walton, the set designer, at his apartment back in 1974. So that made me 11 years old. So there's a whole bunch of, really groovy artistic adults at Tony Walton's apartment. And all the kids are put in another room, right? And the kids, this is like, it's me, probably Bridget Leroy, who is Werner Leroy's daughter, Emma Walton, who is Julie Andrews and Tony Walton's daughter. We were hanging with Amanda Green, Adolph Green's daughter, right? I don't know if it was them, but those were the kids that, we all hung together. So the parents all put us in this other room while they watched Lenny. And I remember wandering out at one point to find my mom, and it took her a while to realize that I was standing there, and then I got ushered very quickly, ushered out of the room, right? Because, the transgression has to happen on the other side of the wall. And I realize now there's that line in All That Jazz where the little girl says lesbian scenes are boring. And it's like, well, I wonder if that's what I walked out into.
Art imitated life, imitated art. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
and then my friend Nancy Simon, who's Neil Simon's daughter, said to me, you can't call it a lesbian scene because she didn't want to participate. So I was like, okay, I don't know how to.
Don't have any words for it.
Right.
Yes.
Do you think a lot, just because, just talking about visual style and how he developed his
Yeah.
visual style, is stuff like All That Jazz you were talking about a little bit earlier, still, nothing looks like that. Especially at the ending, the way that he's able to construct these sort of visual storytelling, it's unbelievable. Do you think a lot of that comes from his theatrical background, or sort of just the people that he's working with? He's a smart guy, he has good taste, so he has a lot of good collaborators, a mix of both. I'm just so curious how he developed
Yeah,
that.
I think it's all of that. So I inherited his library of books, and there's books and books and books of strange makeup and headdresses and Vogue fashion things and weird and wonderful. So he was drawing from everywhere, from Rodin the sculptor to Charlie Chaplin to Fred Astaire to weird Vogue face painting to Kiss, right?
Yeah,
Right?
it's
Like-
everything. It's unbelievable.
I think he was inspired and drew from all
Yeah.
kinds of places where, oh, that's
Yeah.
wonderful, that's wonderful, and then you take some drugs and woo, right?
And having that baseline of really good taste also really helps, I think, too. Just
Yes,
having good
no,
judgment
he
there,
had really
Yeah,
good
judgment, yeah.
taste, really good judgment, and he could find that line
Yeah,
of being really outrageous and still believable,
totally.
Mm.
right?
How are we, are we,
One or two more questions.
how about, yes, ma'am, up top.
This is also another question about the relationship of the artist and his personal life. The show business and performers is a recurring topic within both Fosse films, and people focus not only on their product performance but also on their personal life, right? And it's hard to make a generalization of all the different characters in these movies, but take the Lenny as example. It's hard to say that he has a pleasant personality, and he makes many conflict or controversy choice in his personal life as much as in his public life. Do you think it's based on facts observed by the director, or it's based, or is it what kind of message that he's trying to say here with
Right.
all the conflict?
Well, I think my father made a controversial choice filming this in black and white, right? He also was making controversial choices, so I think he could identify with that, and really, yeah, he could identify with that.
And that duality, as we were talking earlier, about, good guys have bad qualities, bad guys have very attractive qualities, and that's what makes them interesting. So I think that's certainly part of.
Right, I mean, when I watch Star 80, I really like Paul Snyder, even though I don't like him at all. He's a horrible person. I'm charmed by him and drawn to him, and also kind of feel for him too. And I think my father saw himself that way, right? Sally Bowles is really very extravagant and not really talented. I mean, Liza's fabulous, right? But I mean, Sally Bowles is not supposed to be that talented. And I think he felt a camaraderie with that situation in life, and he used the performer because that's what he knew, right? That was very familiar to him, that whole scene. But I think all of us at some point feel that little bit of imposter syndrome thing. Do I really know what I'm doing? Yeah.
He related to that non-competitive part.
Yes, or the edgy part, or the, I'm gonna try something different, I'm gonna
Yeah.
see what happens if I offend you, right? I mean, even in the Broadway show Dancin', the 1978 version, there was a ballet bar in there, a dance that was highly sexualized between two ballet dancers. It was a little bit shocking, and then, you know, in All That Jazz, there's Take Off With Us and Erotica. He was always pushing boundaries, and as charming and lovely as he wasn't always nice to everybody all the time, you know?
Hey guys, I'm so sorry. We have a screening here in 4 minutes, so we're gonna have to go with the Q&A, okay? I'm so sorry. I'd love to have you guys keep talking.